Wyoming Territory, July 1882, the sky cracked open with thunder as the stagecoach rattled hard over the dry ridge, dust whipping up around its wheels like smoke from a brush fire. Inside, Willa Langford gripped her satchel tighter, her knuckles white against the worn leather. She had not seen Carter's Hollow since she was 17, but today she was coming back with 2 children and no husband. The coach jolted to a stop outside the old general store, the only building in town that still looked just the same. Willa stepped down, her boots hitting the dirt with a weight that felt heavier than her small frame. Behind her, Colleen, 12, and Caleb, 9, clambered down, quiet and wide-eyed. They had not said much since leaving Kansas. She did not blame them. Willa pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked down the street. The place still held the bones of the town she had grown up in. The saloon stood shuttered in the heat, the blacksmith's forge was quiet, and the church bell's weathered ropes swayed in the wind. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Nothing moved until she saw him. He had just stepped out of the livery, wiping his hands on a rag, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, taller than she remembered, broader too. The years had settled in his shoulders, his jaw, his eyes. Dust streaked his dark hair and the sun had caught his skin, but she would have known him anywhere. Dawson Reddick, she said, the name falling from her lips before she meant to speak it. He looked up, blinked once, then froze. Willa? His voice broke the silence that clung to the street like heat. She nodded, her throat tight. Dawson tossed the rag over a rail and walked toward her, his boots kicking up little clouds of earth. "What are you doing here?" he asked, stopping just before her, his gaze flicking to the children, then back to her eyes. "I came home," she said simply. He hesitated, then nodded once. "You look strong." "I had to be." They stood like that for a long moment. The wind tugged at her skirts, and Caleb shifted closer to her side. Dawson's eyes lingered on the boy, then on Colleen, who was staring at him with quiet curiosity. "Are they my late husband's?" she said, her voice steady. He looked at her again, carefully this time. "You need a place to stay," she nodded. "I have the cabin still. It is nothing fancy, but it is clean. You can take the back room." She hesitated. "You sure?" He gave one small nod. "You are not sleeping in the street, Willa." The cabin was just east of the creek, tucked back behind a cluster of cottonwoods. Dawson led the wagon while she and the children walked behind. The air smelled of dust and dry pine. Willa remembered the path well. They had once run it barefoot as children, him daring her to leap the stream in one jump, her always landing in the middle. Inside the cabin, light filtered in through one cracked window pane. The floorboards creaked under her boots. The back room still had the old iron bed frame and a wool quilt folded at the foot. "It is yours," Dawson said quietly, noticing her eyes on the bed. "I never changed it." Willa turned to him. "You kept it," he shrugged. "Could not bring myself to throw it out." That night, Willa tucked the children into the narrow bed together and sat on the edge until Caleb's breathing grew slow and Colleen's hand slipped into her own. When she stepped outside, Dawson was at the fire pit, stirring up embers with a stick. She sat across from him, silent for a while. The stars above were bright, and the night air had that high plains chill to it. "Thank you," she said finally. He nodded. "You do not owe me anything." "I did not mean for things to turn out like this, I know. I married Henry because I thought it was the right thing. He was kind, at first." Dawson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "He left me," she said. "Last winter, left a note and disappeared. The land was not ours, and the bank took what little we had. We had nowhere else to go. You should have written." "I did not think I could." He looked at her then, his face a little softer. "You always could, you just did not," she nodded. "I am sorry." He looked away, poking the fire again. "I never married," he said after a while. She looked up. "I waited for a long time, thought maybe you would come back." Her breath caught. "I should not have said that," he muttered, standing. "No," she said quickly. "Do not take it back." He stopped, looked at her, really looked. "I never stopped loving you, Willa," she stood slowly. "I never stopped thinking about you." They were close now, too close. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the dark. "I did not come back to break your heart again," she said. "You came back," he said. She nodded, her voice quiet. "I did." He did not kiss her, not yet, but he reached out and took her hand gently, like he had done once when they were 15 and hiding from a storm under the schoolhouse steps. "I will help you," he said. "You and the children. Whatever you need." She squeezed his hand. "I believe you." And for the first time in years, Willa felt like maybe she could stop running. By late August, the dry wind had begun to shift. The heat still clung to the days, but the nights hinted at the coming change. Willa rose before the sun most mornings, slipping out to the pump behind the cabin to draw water while the children slept. Her palms had blistered and healed in layers since she'd arrived, but she didn't mind. The sting of labor was easier to bear than the weight of helplessness. Dawson had taken to letting her help in the garden behind the barn, though he said little about it. He handed her tools without instruction, and she returned them clean and sharpened. It was a quiet rhythm, the kind that made a person feel steady again. One afternoon, while Willa was gathering rosemary from the far corner of the patch, she glanced up to find a man on horseback just beyond the split-rail fence. He didn't call out or wave, just sat there, watching her with narrowed eyes under a wide-brimmed hat cracked with age. His expression was unreadable, but his posture held the kind of stillness that didn't come from idleness. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, wiping her hands on her skirt. "You're the Langford girl," he said, his voice flat. She paused. "I'm Willa Langford, yes." The man's horse shifted beneath him. "You ought not be planting in this soil," she blinked. "Excuse me, crop's been failing 2 seasons straight. Ever since you come back, things have turned worse." Her stomach dropped. "That doesn't make sense." "Maybe not to you," he tipped his chin. "But folks remember your mother, how she kept charms in the windows and muttered to herself after sundown. People said she was touched." "My mother was ill," Willa said quietly. "She was strange," the man replied. "And strange runs in the blood." Dawson's voice came from behind the fence. "You can turn that horse around, Ellis." The rider looked past her to where Dawson stood, hammer in one hand, sleeve rolled up, eyes steady. "Just giving her fair warning," Ellis said. "Consider it given." "Now go." Ellis hesitated, then yanked the reins and rode off, dust rising behind him like smoke. Willa turned back to Dawson. "Did he just accuse me of causing poor harvests?" "He's not the only one talking that way." Dawson stepped over the fence, brushing dirt from his trousers. "There's been whispers since last week. Someone's blaming you." She looked down at the rosemary in her hand. "Because I came back. They're scared. Drought's been hard. When folks don't understand something, they find someone to carry it. I thought that kind of fear died with my mother. It never dies. It just waits for a reason." Later that evening, Willa sat on the porch steps, peeling potatoes into a tin basin while the crickets started their chorus. Dawson joined her with a tin cup of coffee, sitting beside her in silence for a long while. "I can leave," she said softly, "if it's going to make things worse for you. You're not leaving." He didn't look at her. "This is your home." "I'm not sure the town agrees. They don't get to decide that." She turned to him. "Why are you doing this for me?" He met her gaze then. "Because I know who you are." She set the knife down and looked out toward the pasture. "I used to believe that was enough." "It is." 2 days later, a stone shattered the front window. The children were at the creek when it happened, chasing frogs between the reeds. Willa had been sweeping out the back room. She heard the glass break and ran into the main room, heart in her throat. Dawson was already outside, standing barefoot in the dust, the stone in his hand. No one was in sight. That evening, they boarded up the window with scrap wood. The children didn't ask why. Willa didn't sleep that night. She lay beside Colleen and stared at the dark ceiling, her mind full of old stories her mother used to whisper, tales of women burned in Europe, of healers shunned, of midwives chased with pitchforks. She'd thought those things belonged to another world. The next morning, Dawson left early to check the west pasture. Willa walked the edge of the property alone, watching for footprints or broken twigs, anything that might tell her who had thrown the stone. She found nothing but the same dry grass and brittle soil. At midday, a rider came into the clearing. He carried no rifle, wore no spurs, and his horse bore a hide blanket instead of a saddle. His hair was braided down his back, and his expression was calm, but his eyes, dark and deep, missed nothing. Willa stepped forward, unsure. He inclined his head in greeting. "I am called Motto," she hesitated. "Willa," he looked past her toward the cabin, "you are the one being blamed." "Yes, I heard it in town," she studied him. "Why would you come all the way out here?" "I was at the trading post when a man said your presence poisoned his wheat. I asked him how a woman could do such a thing. He had no answer. I have none either." Motto dismounted. "I do not believe the land turns against people. I believe people turn against each other." She watched him as he knelt, brushing his fingers over the soil near the fence line. "There is no sickness in this ground," he said, "only thirst." She walked closer. "How do you know?" "I was raised to read it. My grandfather taught me before the soldiers burned his home." She didn't know what to say to that. The wind stirred the grass around them. "You are not the cause," he said, "but you are the one they can reach." "Why tell me this?" "Because I have seen what happens when fear is left to grow. It spreads wider than any drought." That evening, Motto returned. He brought a pouch of dried tobacco and a small bundle wrapped in muslin. "For your children," he said. "Juniper and willow bark, steep it in water if they cough." Willa accepted it carefully. "Thank you." Dawson stood on the porch behind her, arms crossed, watching Motto with a guarded expression. "I'm grateful," Willa said. "Truly," Motto nodded. "I'll return in 3 days. I want to show you something. Both of you." Dawson stepped down. "What is it?" "Proof." 3 days later, they rode out before dawn, Dawson and Willa on his gray mare, Motto on his paint. The children stayed behind with a neighbor they trusted. They followed Motto northwest, past the butts and into a narrow valley where the grass grew taller than Willa's shoulders and the wild plums hung heavy on their branches. "There," Motto said, pointing. A dozen small plots, each no larger than a blanket, had been cleared and planted with millet, beans, and squash. They were green, thriving. "I started them last spring," he said. "Same soil, same sky, no one cursed the ground here." Willa stared. "How?" "I asked the land what it needed. I listened." Dawson crouched, running his hand through the earth. "It's darker, richer. Comes from a stream beneath," Motto said. "It doesn't shout, but it's there." Willa turned to him. "You can help us prove I didn't do anything. I can help you show them what's true." She felt something shift inside her, then something that had been locked up for years. Not hope exactly, but a beginning. As they rode back that afternoon, Dawson reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers in the saddle. She didn't pull away. They would not be silent. They would not retreat. The land had not turned against her, and now she wasn't alone. The last of the summer heat broke in early September. A slow unraveling of sun warped days into cooler air and longer shadows. Willa stood at the edge of the garden behind the cabin, watching the first pale shoots of onion and sorrel push through the soil she and Colleen had turned by hand. It was not much, but it was honest growth, and she had come to understand the difference. Dawson had taken to making the morning rounds with Caleb, teaching him how to check fence lines and read the behavior of the horses. Willa didn't ask what they talked about out there, but Caleb came back with dust on his boots and a steadier look in his eyes. Colleen spent her hours between chores drawing in the margins of an old ledger book Dawson had once used for cattle counts. The pages had taken to her pencil like they'd been waiting. Motto returned, as he said he would, with a worn canvas sack slung over his shoulder and the same quiet grace that seemed to come from the earth itself. He didn't stay long. Just walked the length of the garden, paused by the creek where Colleen had left a bundle of sage to dry, then handed Willa a folded piece of parchment. Inside was a map. Small but detailed, marked with the locations of natural springs and shaded valleys where the soil held better moisture. Some were within a day's ride, others farther. In the corner, he'd written the Lakota name for each place in clean, deliberate script. She ran her fingers over it. "How did you make this?" My grandfather walked the land for years. He taught me his paths before the soldiers forced us east. I walked them again last spring. She glanced up. Why share this? Because the land does not belong to one people, he said. But those who respect it may borrow its strength. That evening, Willa laid the map flat on the table. Dawson stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes following the lines and symbols. If we move the bean rows near the old ash grove, she said, tapping a point northeast of the cabin, we'd be closer to one of these springs, he nodded. We'd need to clear some brush. And shift the fence. I can do the brushwork, she offered. You handle the fence. He looked at her then, not as someone in need, but as someone beside him. All right, he said. We start tomorrow. By the week's end, the new plot was staked out. Dawson had borrowed a drawknife from the blacksmith and split rails until his palms bled. Willa burned the brush in a low fire after soaking the ground around it, smoke curling up in thin lines that vanished into the sky without a trace. News of mottos helped spread without their saying a word. A boy from town came asking where he could find the spring shown on the map. Then a widow from the south pasture rode up with a jar of milk and questions about soil depth. Some folks didn't come around at all, but the silence no longer held the same weight. One afternoon, as Willa was walking back from the orchard with a pail of windfall apples, she spotted Sheriff Lyle Graves at the edge of the trail. He was leaning against his sorrel mare, hat in hand, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He didn't speak until she was close. Town council's meeting tomorrow evening, she set the pail down. Why? Folks are still talking. Some think Motto's garden was a trick. Others say it's unnatural for plants to grow when everything else is turning brown. They've seen the soil. They've seen the water. Some don't want to believe it. They'd rather keep their fear. She folded her arms. Do they plan to come here again? Not if I've got any say in it. He kicked at a stone with the toe of his boot. But I'd feel better if you came to the meeting. I wasn't invited. You are now. She arrived just before dusk, dust clinging to her hem, hair braided back and pinned with care. Dawson rode beside her, his coat pressed, rifle behind his saddle though he didn't mention it. The meeting was held at the old schoolhouse, its windows open to the warm evening air. Inside, lanterns flickered along the walls, casting long shadows across the plank floor. About 20 people stood or sat on benches, farmers, merchants, wives with tight mouths and knitted shawls. Motto had arrived earlier and stood near the back, arms folded, unmoved by the stares. Willa stepped forward when Sheriff Graves nodded to her. I didn't come here looking for trouble, she said, her voice clear. I came because I had nowhere else to go. I lost more than my home. And yet I've worked every day since I arrived. I've planted with my own hands. The same hands that held my children when they were sick. The same hands that helped bury their father. No one spoke. I didn't curse your crops. I didn't bring the drought. I've lost too. Motto showed us where the land still lives. He didn't ask for payment. He gave knowledge freely. You can believe that or not, but I won't stand here and carry your fear anymore. A murmur swept through the room. An older woman with a lined face stood. You said we can find water. I've got hens dying from heat. Tell me where. Willa stepped down, took the woman's hand, and opened the map. By the time the meeting ended, the air had shifted. Not changed entirely, but softened at the edges. Outside, Dawson helped her into the saddle, then lingered beside her stirrup. You didn't flinch, he said. I'm tired of flinching. He lifted his eyes to hers. Come walk with me tomorrow after breakfast, she nodded. The next morning, they left the children with Motto, who had taken to sitting on the porch in the early hours, quietly carving lengths of wood into slender, curved figures. Colleen liked to guess what they would become. Caleb just watched. Willa and Dawson walked the creek trail, boots brushing against golden thistle and dry sedge. It was quiet but not empty. The air smelled of river stone and cold water, not the kind that rushed loud but the kind that knew how to stay. They stopped near the bend where the cottonwoods grew thickest. He leaned against a trunk, arms folded, watching her. I used to think you'd never come back, he said. Told myself it didn't matter, that I had the land, the horses, that was enough. You believed it, sometimes. She stepped closer. You didn't ask if I'd stay. I didn't want to hear no. She reached into her skirt pocket and drew out a small cloth bundle. Inside was a ring silver, thin, plain but polished, the kind made by someone who had tools but not money, time but not ease. She held it out. It was my mother's. She gave it to me before I left home, said to keep it for when I knew where I belonged. He didn't take it at first, just looked at it, then up at her. You sure? I am. He reached out and took the ring, then knelt in the dirt beneath the cottonwood, his eyes steady. I've waited a long time. I don't need anything grand, just you beside me. Yes, she said, barely above a whisper. He stood and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. They walked back with their hands clasped, the morning light breaking through the trees in long, golden strips. When they reached the cabin, Caleb looked up from the porch, then grinned. Colleen didn't say anything, but her eyes shone. Motto nodded once, slow and knowing. That night, Dawson stood behind her as she peeled apples for pie. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin against her shoulder. You'll stay? I'll stay. Outside, the wind stirred the tall grass. The earth was still dry, still waiting, but in the cabin there was warmth. There was breath. And Willa, who had once been blamed for ruin, now stood in the heart of something growing. The first frost came early that year. It crept in one morning before the sun had burned the mist off the fields, laying a thin silver crust across the cabbage heads and turning the creek edges to glass. Willa stood at the cabin threshold, arms wrapped around herself, listening to the hush that came with the season's turn. The air smelled different now, wood smoke, damp earth, and the clean bite of cold. Inside, Dawson was mending the heel of Caleb's boot with a strip of elk hide he'd soaked the night before. He worked in silence, eyes narrowed in concentration, the boy kneeling beside him, watching each stitch like it mattered. Willa didn't interrupt. She let the warmth of the scene settle in her chest before stepping back inside. That day, Motto returned with a wrapped bundle under his arm, his horse lathered and breathing deep from the ride. I came from the South Ridge, he said. A family there lost 3 cows to wolf bites. They're asking if Dawson knows how to set a line. Dawson wiped his hands on a rag. I'll ride out tomorrow morning. Motto nodded, then turned to Willa. I brought something for the councilwoman. She asked me to pass it along after the meeting. He handed her the bundle. Inside was a collection of dried herbs and a folded note bearing the simple message, for your tea, strength and calm. She said the way you spoke reminded her of her sister, Motto added. The one who died after the war. I didn't know she had a sister. She doesn't tell many. Willa tucked the herbs into the cupboard beside the tin of salt. I'll write her a letter. She should know I'm grateful. That evening, after the children had gone to bed and the fire had settled to embers, Willa sat at the table with Dawson, her fingers brushing the rim of her tea mug. She wants me to come speak at the next town gathering, she said. He looked up from the pages he was tallying. About what, land care, what Motto showed us, what we planted. She says people are listening now. He leaned back, stretching his legs out under the table. You think you'll do it? I think I should. He studied her for a moment, then closed the ledger. You'll do fine. I don't want to say something wrong or too much. You won't. She looked down at her hands. What if they change their minds again? Then we start over. Same as we did before. She nodded, then reached across the table and laid her hand over his. His fingers curled around hers, steady and warm. The next morning, Dawson left just after sunrise, taking the south trail with 2 coils of wire, a rifle across his back, and a length of jerky in his coat pocket. Willa watched him ride out, the mare's hooves muffled in the frost-softened earth. Colleen returned from the creek with a basket of damp laundry and a story about a bird she had seen a hawk with a torn wing, balancing in the reeds. Willa listened as she wrung out the sheets and hung them on the line, the girl's voice bright against the stillness of the day. By afternoon, Motto arrived again, this time on foot, his horse tied at the edge of the grove. He carried a satchel woven from thick reed grass, and when Willa invited him inside, he shook his head. "I won't stay long," he said. "But I came because someone's been asking questions about you." She stepped down from the porch. "Who?" "Ellis." Her jaw tightened. "He's been riding to ranches past the northern ridge, saying the council was tricked, that you and I planted that garden in a different season, that we brought in water from somewhere else." "That's not true." I told him that. "He doesn't care." She looked toward the hills. "What's he trying to do?" Stir doubt. "He knows he won't win by force, but fear's quieter than fire. It spreads easier." Willa glanced back toward the cabin. "The children, they're safe, but you need to be ready." She nodded. "What would you do?" "Stand steady. Let them see you don't flinch." After he left, Willa walked the edge of the property, checking the fence posts, watching the trail for prints. She found none. But the sense of being watched lingered, like the echo of a storm that hadn't yet broken. Dawson returned 2 days later, dust-caked and sunburned, but uninjured. He brought news that the wolves had moved on, and that the family on the ridge had offered him a jar of pickled corn and a hand-knit scarf in thanks. "I told them to keep both," he said, setting his rifle beside the door. "They've got 4 children and a roof that leaks worse than ours." Willa handed him a cup of cider and sat on the step beside him. "Ellis is stirring trouble again. I figured he would. He's saying motto and I made up the garden. That we faked it." Dawson drank, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "He's trying to keep people from trusting what you've taught. He wants to undo everything." "He won't." She turned to him. "You're sure?" "I know a man who's losing ground. That's what this is. He's trying to claw his way back." She leaned into his shoulder, letting the weight of the day settle. "I'm tired of clawing. You don't have to anymore." A week later, the councilwoman rode out herself. Her gray bonnet was tied tight against the wind, and her gloves were worn thin at the thumbs. "I came to ask a favor," she said as Willa poured her tea. "Of course. There's a family moving in near the low ridge, newly arrived from Missouri. They lost their land to fire and came here with nothing but a wagon and a cow too old to milk. We're trying to set them up proper. I thought maybe you could show them your garden, help them start one." Willa set the teapot down. "I'd be glad to. They've got 3 daughters. The oldest is near Colleen's age, but skittish. I know how to handle skittish." The woman smiled, then sipped. "I thought you might." The next day, Willa rode to the low ridge with Colleen and a basket of dried lentils and root cuttings. The family's wagon sat tilted near a slope of wind-worn rocks, canvas patched and fraying. The mother met them with wary eyes and a toddler on her hip. The father stood back, his face weathered, one boot missing its sole. Willa offered her name, then knelt to show the children how to press lentil seeds into the soil. Colleen knelt beside her, handing them small stones to mark each row. By the time the sun dipped low, the father had joined them, his broad hands careful as he followed Willa's lead. They left the rest of the seeds behind. On the ride home, Colleen leaned against her mother's side. "Do you think they'll be all right?" "They've got to start." The frost deepened as October settled, bringing with it the slow hush of a land preparing to sleep. The beans in their new plot had held on longer than expected, and the squash had ripened in thick, ridged bulbs. Willa dried every bit that could be kept, laid up roots in the dugout cellar beneath the cabin, and taught Caleb how to check for spoilage with a tap of his knuckle. One night, as the wind howled through the cottonwoods and the chimney moaned, Dawson sat across from her at the table, turning something small in his hands. "I've been thinking," he said. She looked up from her stitching. "About spring," she waited. "There's a parcel west of here. About 15 acres. It backs against the foothills and gets morning light. It's for sale. The man who owns it's heading to Oregon come thaw." She set her sewing down. "You want to buy it?" "I want us to." She was quiet a moment. "That would make it ours." "That's the idea." She stood, walked around the table, and laid her hand against his cheek. "Then let's." His arms came around her, slow and certain, and they stood there in the quiet cabin, the wind outside rising and falling like the tide. In the spring, they would walk new land. In the spring, they would build together. But for now they had warmth and peace, and the strength that grows in soil once thought barren. The land thawed slow that year. By late March, the last crusts of snow were still holding to the northern slopes, and the creek ran high with meltwater, rushing through its banks with purpose. Willa watched it from the edge of the pasture, her palms braced on the fence rail, sleeves rolled to the elbow as the morning sun warmed the nape of her neck. She could smell wet bark and turned earth, and the faint sweetness of plum blossoms starting to open in the orchard Dawson had trimmed back with careful hands. A month had passed since the councilwoman's visit. The family on the low ridge had begun raising a frame for a sod-roofed shelter, and word from the trading post said more families were drifting westward, some from burned-out farms in Nebraska, others from the flooded valleys of Missouri. Carter's Hollow, once a place of shrinking numbers and shuttered buildings, had begun to stir. Inside the cabin, Colleen sorted wool scraps by color, her fingers quick and quiet. Motto had shown her how to bind them into a coiled rug, and she'd taken to the work with a quiet pride Willa recognized. Caleb was outside with Dawson, helping to dig post holes along the southern boundary of the new parcel. The boy's shoulders had begun to square, and he no longer hesitated before asking questions. Willa stepped inside and picked up the small tin box Dawson had left on the shelf by the hearth. Inside were the signed land papers and a folded note from the seller, a wiry man named Ezra who'd once trapped beaver in the foothills and now planned to follow his brother west. The ink was faded, but the intent was clear. The land was theirs, paid and recorded. She traced the edge of the paper, then closed the lid and set it back. She would not need to look again. That evening, Dawson brought in a bundle of dry pine and set it beside the hearth. His shirt clung damp to his collar, and his knuckles were raw where the post-hole digger had slipped. "You should let that skin," she said, taking his hand. He let her guide him to the table where she unwound a strip of clean muslin and dipped it in warm water. "You're not going to fuss over every scrape I bring in," he said. "I might." He watched her wrap his hand. "We'll finish the last 5 posts tomorrow, then it's ready." She tied the cloth and smoothed the edge, and after that he rested his other hand over hers. "We build." Willa looked at him across the dim light of the lamp, the lines of his face softened by the hush of evening. "You ever think this would be what it looked like, your life?" He shook his head. "I didn't know what shape it would take, just that I'd know it when it came." She leaned in close. "And now, I know." At dawn, she woke to the sound of laughter outside, a low, surprised bark from Dawson and the high, breathless giggle of Caleb. She pulled on her shawl and stepped out to see the boy holding up a turtle, its shell streaked with mud, its legs kicking gently at the air. "Found him by the stream," Caleb said, eyes bright. "He was stuck on his back." Dawson knelt beside him. "You helped him, that's good." Willa smiled. "Where'll you put him?" "In the grass by the orchard." "There's shade." She watched the boy take off at a trot, turtle cupped in both hands like a treasure. Dawson stood, brushing his palms on his trousers. "That boy's got a heart bigger than he shows." He always did. Just needed time to let it out. They walked the edge of the new land together, the sun climbing slow and gold behind them. The soil was soft underfoot, still damp from the thaw, and the fence posts stood straight in their line, ready to hold what would come. Willa stopped near the eastern slope where a stand of birch trees leaned into the wind. "We could build here," she said. "Cabin facing the morning light." Dawson looked out over the rise. "We could run a porch along the front, sit out and see the hills. A garden behind. And a smokehouse when we're ready." He turned to her. "You want to start soon?" "I want to start now." They spent the next weeks clearing brush and leveling ground, cutting timbers from the grove with care and hauling stone from the creek. Neighbors came to help, some who had once watched with suspicion, now offering tools and time without asking for anything in return. They brought bread, nails, bundles of straw. Motto returned with a pair of cedar beams and a quiet nod of approval. Colleen helped notch the joists for the roof frame, and Caleb learned to mix mud for the chinking between logs. The work was slow and honest, and each day ended with sore muscles and quiet satisfaction. By late May, the walls stood, roof laid and windows framed. The door had not yet been hung, but Willa stepped inside the empty shell and felt the air shift around her like breath. Dawson came in behind her, arms bare and streaked with sweat, his hair damp from the spring heat. "I never built a home from the ground up," he said. "You have now." He looked around at the space, then back to her. "You think it's enough. For me, it's everything." That night they slept on a bed of blankets in the unfinished cabin beneath the stars visible through the open beams above. The wind passed gentle through the gaps, and the air smelled of fresh-cut wood and wild mint growing near the creek. Willa lay beside him, her head on his shoulder, her fingers tracing the edge of his collarbone. "I used to think peace was something other people had," she said. "What changed? You?" His arm tightened around her. "I'm not going anywhere, I know." They were married under the birches in the shade of the same grove where they'd chosen to build. No preacher came. Motto stood with them, and the councilwoman bore witness. Colleen stitched a ribbon for her mother's hair, pale blue and sewn with tiny glass beads she'd traded for from a traveling peddler. Caleb wore a clean shirt and carried a small bouquet of wild plum blossoms. Willa wore her mother's ring, the silver catching the light as Dawson took her hand. The vows were quiet, spoken not as promises meant to impress but as truth already lived. Afterward, they shared bread and honey beneath the trees, and the children ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter a thread of music between the trees. The cabin filled slowly. Willa hung dried herbs from the rafters, and Dawson built shelves for books and tools. Colleen kept her drawings in a wooden box Dawson carved for her, and Caleb began keeping a journal, each page a record of what he had seen or learned that day. Motto returned often, sometimes with a gift, a woven satchel, a carved whistle, a pouch of seeds, and sometimes with nothing but silence and company, which Willa had come to value just as much. The land held. The garden grew. One morning, Willa walked the ridge alone, the air cool and bright, the grass damp with dew. She stood at the edge of their land and looked out across the fold of hills and trees, the cabin behind her, smoke curling from the chimney. She had known loss and fear and the long ache of trying to belong. Now she knew something else, the quiet certainty of love that had been earned, not given. A life built piece by piece with patience and grit and the kind of care that didn't ask to be seen loud. She turned back toward home, the morning sun warm on her face, and walked down the slope with steady steps. In the years that followed, the cabin stood strong. The orchard bore fruit. The children grew. New families settled nearby, and the town began to stitch itself into something fuller, something rooted. And every night, as the lamp was blown out and the dark settled in soft and sure, Willa lay beside Dawson, her hand in his, the ring cool against his skin, and knew without question that she had come home.